Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
On Bloomberg Radio, on the satellite radio, and on YouTube, where you can search Bloomberg Business News Live. Find us. Our live stream awaits you with news from the campaign trail today and from Chicago. We were just talking to Nathan Dean about what's going to take place next week at the DNC, and we do have news on the lineup this morning. Pretty interesting to think about the way this is all going to work, knowing, of course, Tim Walz will be speaking on Wednesday night, and Kamala Harris will speak on Thursday. We're filling in the blanks. Joe Biden is going to open this thing on Monday. We've talked about that with Rick and Jeanne already. They're kind of ripping off the Band-Aid, check the box, get Joe Biden done Monday night so we can look to the future. Former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, it turns out, is also being held on Monday night. Gets more interesting from there. Tuesday, Barack Obama. It is his hometown, after all. And a big part of the reason why Joe Biden is not in this race anymore. Then it's Bill Clinton. Isn't this interesting? On Wednesday night, introducing Tim Walz, not Hillary Clinton. They're going to the former president for this one, presumably for some kind of a folksy presentation. And this is where we start with our panel today. They're both back with us. Bloomberg Politics contributor Jeanne Zaino, political science professor, Iona University, and senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Rick Davis, partner Stone Court Capital, of course, and longtime Republican strategist. What do you make of the lineup here, Jeanne? I know I'm probably reading into all this stuff, but you get Hillary and Joe Biden out of the way on Monday night so you can feature Bill Clinton on what will be a very well-watched night on Wednesday with the vice president. Why these decisions?
I do think it makes sense. Obviously, both Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton have run, and of course, he won. She did not. They served together in Obama's administration. So I do think that makes sense. And then to your point, you have Barack Obama, a great speaker, and it's his hometown, and still widely beloved. I'm curious to see if we hear anything from Michelle Obama. Haven't heard her name yet. And Bill Clinton, he's known as one of the people who really does a great job introducing somebody like Waltz. I keep wondering, does he pull out the old saxophone? Who knows what happens? But they do have a similar sort of background in terms of being from, the Midwest and, having served as governors and that kind of thing. So I do think that makes sense. And then, of course, the question becomes, who introduces Kamala Harris? I am curious to see as well. I don't think we know that yet.
No, we don't. And Rick, you've run a convention. So talk to me about the process that goes into decisions like these when you're figuring out the speaking schedule and how to best capture the media coverage that'll come with it.
Yeah, you can imagine the monkey wrench that was thrown into this 3 weeks ago when the top of the ticket flipped and all the focus, all the agenda was built around showcasing Joe Biden's accomplishments as president and his vision for the next presidency. And that includes the kinds of people who are speaking, the stories of Joe Biden's, growing up and, his sort of, middle-class roots and, working hard for the working man. And now all that has been turned upside down. So there's a lot of rewriting that's going on and a lot of new recruitment of new faces. And as you've described, these are the standards, right? When you've got former presidents and former nominees aplenty who are willing actually to come to the convention, unlike the Republican convention where George W. Bush wasn't willing to be anywhere near that zip code when Donald Trump was doing his victory lap. You have ready and willing participants. And so how do you then juggle them around? And I do think that part of the Biden burden for the convention managers was talking about his legacy without sounding like he's been around forever, right? And playing to the age issue. Here, you don't have that problem. It's all going to be new, almost as if Harris wasn't even part of the Biden administration. We'll get credit for that to Joe Biden and all the accomplishments, and then she'll peel off and say, and then for the future, here's my act. And that's where the new economic policy comes in. That's where the new optics come in with my new vice president, Walz. And so I think that will be the handoff, that Bill Clinton gives to Walz, and then they peel into it, on Wednesday and Thursday night.
Jeanne, Bill Clinton is 77 years old. He's 1 year younger than Donald Trump. This is who has been chosen now to introduce Tim Walz on Wednesday night. This is an individual who was almost canceled. I don't think that's possible with a former president. Certainly Donald Trump has proven that. But was not seen as a helping hand to the Democratic Party during the Me Too movement. It looked like he was being moved to the sidelines here. Are you surprised to see him with such a prominent role in 2024?
I'm not. He is a former president who is living, healthy, able to speak. To your point, obviously, there is a lot there, and we saw that in the Me Too movement, rightly so. And I think that may be one of the many reasons why you don't see him on a Thursday night introducing Kamala Harris. But again, he is proven to be over several decades really, really good at getting out there, speaking to Democrats, particularly the kind of Democrats that Kamala Harris and Tim Walz want to appeal to, which are from the Midwest, from these Rust Belt states. I mean, after all, that's how Bill Clinton made his name, as a very, very moderate Democrat who went out there and showed that the Democrats were not so liberal that they should, just be washed away in an election that he ended up winning. So, he does have that appeal. Certainly, obviously, it comes with downsides. And I think, in my mind, one of the big questions is, what do they do in terms of a direction on the Thursday night for Kamala Harris? I think there's a lot of really, really attractive possibilities. I'm going to put my vote in for Michelle Obama and Beyonce, Charlie as well, but there's a lot of others. But I do think it showcases that difference from that Wednesday to Thursday night in terms of generation.
Big time. It's a big turning of the page here, unless, of course, the uncommitteds cause a problem, Rick. I don't think they'll disrupt the whole flow here, but it could be part of the story. They're calling them ceasefire delegates. Up in Boston this morning, Rick, according to Politico, there are about 30 uncommitted delegates representing the Democratic primary voters who opposed Joe Biden. This, of course, brings us to the matter of Israel and the many uncommitted votes that we saw in some of the swing states during the primaries that we talked about. Rick, if you were running this convention, as you have done in your career, what would you be doing right now to try to meet with these people, to try to diffuse the situation before everybody shows up in Chicago?
Yeah, I mean, we talked about this the other day, Joe, and I suggested that, you'd want to put a group together that would start literally hand-holding these folks, trying to resolve issues and, find things of interest that they have in the platform and other options, future administration points of view. And also, work them over hard on the fact that, Donald Trump's not their kind of person. They shouldn't do anything to enhance his appeal. And then I would make sure that I surrounded them with my best political operatives when they're inside the convention, so that at least I got a heads up. But for sure, I mean, most of them are in Michigan delegation. And that Michigan delegation would probably be sitting in the rafters, where there would be literally no ability for a camera crew to take a picture of them.
All right, now we're getting warmer, Jeanne. How do you think Kamala Harris and her campaign handled this? We talked yesterday about the potential for thousands of protesters outside. What about the couple of dozen inside?
Yeah, and those couple of dozen are arguably even more potentially problematic for the DNC and the Democrats than the thousands outside. In addition to Michigan, we've also got some from Minnesota, and that creates a dilemma in terms of what Rick's talking about. I don't know if you can put the Minnesota delegates in the rafters because they have a vice presidential nominee there. And so that, I think, is where the issue is. But I do think the Democrats are exercising good risk management here. They have, been meeting with these folks. They've been talking to them. They have a list of demands. Certainly some of them they're never going to meet. But if they can start to meet these people halfway, or a quarter of the way, if you will, they may be able to get them to hold off on doing anything which shows dissension and does what none of them want, which is showing support for Donald Trump. So I do think this is the way to proceed. But of course, this is going to be one of the big things that the media are watching for the entire week.
To what extent should Democrats be leveraging celebrity in this convention, Rick? You just heard Jeanne mention Beyonce. That's the caliber we could be talking about here. Everything we hear coming out of the DNC is big surprises, lots of entertainment. We've seen a lot of musicians and entertainers showing up for Kamala Harris on the campaign trail. Is there a point of diminishing returns for Democrats on this?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, look, voters are going to look in and they want to see something that they can vote on, right? And it's not an up or down vote on Beyonce and her latest outfit. That stuff is entertaining to the delegates. It's entertaining to the media. We'll have a blast watching and listening to it when we're there. Yeah. Most of it does not get broadcast on network television or on cable. So it's the kind of thing that has a diminishing return. But at the end of the day, Donald Trump brought the World Wrestling Championship types to his convention. You can expect Hollywood to show up at the Democratic convention and, pick your poison.
One of the highlights of Milwaukee for me was the split screen with Rick, Jeanne, and Kid Rock as part of our live coverage. Jeanne, how do you counter Kid Rock? That's Beyonce then. You just said it, right?
It could be Beyonce. It could be Charlie X. What is it, Joe? CSX, XCX. You correct
Whatever
me, Joe.
You say. Sure.
And one thing we do know is they have a really, really at the Democratic side well-developed streaming output that's going to go out. They have been targeting Gen Z like no tomorrow. And also we're hearing that they are moving away, as the Republicans did, from A-list celebrities to more targeted folks. So, people who can really target those groups that they want to get out. So, as much as we all love Beyonce, she may just be too A-list, this kind of voter targeting activity. So it's a really fascinating way in which they're doing it. Yeah, she's too mainstream, Joe. Listen, Donald Trump wants gamers, the Democrats want somebody else. So I think we're going to see some targeted names that have, can really move the needle with this group. And Joe, the vibe, very, very important this year. So happy, good vibes is what they're going for.
Yeah, I know how brat you are, Jeanne. An XCX from producer James. They're listening to Brat in the control room right now, making fun of us. Rick, you're saved by the bell. I'm not going to ask you about any of the performers in Chicago. That's a no comment from Rick Davis. Great panel. Thank you both. It's quite all right. They're going to be back with us in our second hour. The best panel in the business, Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino, here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Radio. We'll invite our global television audience to our little talk here coming up. Aren't we lucky we get to do this every day in the midst of one of the most historic presidential campaign cycles of our lives? Coming up next hour, Kailey's back from New York, too. She'll be here with us on Balance of Power, and a conversation coming up with Michael Allen from Beacon Global Strategies. And the news that we haven't even had a chance to touch yet from Israel today and from Ukraine. We've got a lot cooking. You want to stay with us here on Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Right here on Bloomberg TV and radio, where you can find us every day at this time without fail. We always will start at 1 p.m. Eastern time.
I know where you're going.
Wasn't necessarily the case with the promised 8 p.m. start last night of the X space between Elon Musk and Donald Trump. Started a little bit behind schedule, and we're blaming technical difficulties, or if Elon Musk is to be believed, a denial of service attack.
Yeah, right. That's correct. It was 40 minutes late. Just to bring everyone in for 1 second, because we're always honest, it's just us here. Kailey and I were on the train back from New York, so we were the captive audience. We had nothing left, nothing else to do. And you got in pretty quick.
I made it
took me
into
about
the
a half an
spaces
hour.
where no one else could. I couldn't tell if I was honored or
Well, I don't know. I
scared.
felt like you had an invitation, but you got to listen to that great music for 40 minutes while I continued. Finally got in, and then we sat there for 2 hours listening to what sounded like a couple of guys talking on the phone.
Yeah. Oh, it was just and it was as promised, an unscripted conversation. Elon
Yes,
Musk
indeed.
said it would be, and that there were no limits to the subject matter. But frankly, the subject matter did stray often back to what we hear repeatedly from Donald Trump, who
That's true.
spoke a lot, and not all of it attacks aimed at his opponent, Kamala Harris.
You know, Stephanie Lai, it was her job to listen to it as well. She was listening, so you don't have to. Bloomberg White House and politics reporter with us now at the table. Stephanie, thank you for being here, as always. I'm sure you're still recovering from this whole episode as well. How do we refer to this? It was essentially a 2-hour live political advertisement. And the Trump campaign was actually running ads on it. It was sponsoring the space. So was this basically a Trump campaign ad buy?
I mean, we have to remember that this was a conversation. You know, I think at some points during the day before, some media outlets were naming it an interview with Elon Musk.
Yeah.
And that really wasn't the case. You know, it was very much Elon Musk giving his opinion on some topic and asking Trump, you know, how do you feel about this? Or, you know, is this what you think as well? And so, you know, this entire event felt like a rally, but just there was some conversation between.
Yeah, a digital one, perhaps. I have to say, when I was taking part in the space, I was one of what I saw at maximum, a 1.3 million that were tuned in at that time. But I know Donald Trump on it last night said something closer to 60 million.
Yeah.
X itself said the engagement levels beyond that were far higher. So I guess the question, Stephanie, is that all they were trying to achieve? To point out, as Donald Trump has been very concerned with the crowd size that Kamala Harris has been drawing in, that he has the ability to get that many people to listen to him on whatever Elon Musk and he decide to talk about?
Yeah, I mean, they were looking for some sort of splashy event to make headlines, to bring the attention back to the campaign, because the last 3 weeks, we've really seen the focus on Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. There's been so much momentum behind them, just given the fact that we're in this news cycle where we're figuring out what the Democratic ticket is going to look like, what the agenda is going to look like. And so this was really the moment for the Trump campaign to regain the narrative and to maybe make some news. But from what I was hearing...
Was news made?
There was no news made. It was very much just Trump rehashing what he said in the past, his past proposals. I think one thing that stuck out to me was that he mentioned that he was worried of nuclear warming, which was not a phrase that I had heard before. But essentially the idea is, you know, we have to be worried about our national security.
Sure, yeah.
A lot of countries have access to nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
But that wasn't anything that I quite heard of, or that term specifically.
Different version on a refrain from Donald Trump. By the way, you know, it was Elon Musk who I think first called it an interview, and then the Trump campaign called it, I think, the most important interview of all time as it was getting ready to get started. But so, you know, picture us there. We're clacking down the tracks on this 40 minutes into this, and we've got the earbuds in, and then the music stops, and we hear this.
We unfortunately had a massive distributed denial of service attack against our servers. As this massive attack illustrates, there's a lot of opposition to people just hearing what President Trump has to say.
There was a question about whether this invitation would be extended to Kamala Harris. Elon Musk has suggested as much. He referred to her as Kamala as opposed to President Trump in his tweet. Will the Harris campaign indulge such an invitation?
I've not seen any signals just yet, but you know, even last week when Trump was interviewed by a video gamer, Aiden Ross, he also extended an invitation to the Vice President Harris. And so it's not entirely clear if that's really the audience that they're looking for.
Does she get a Cybertruck too if she does it?
Maybe. We'll see. Yeah.
That's the question. And a watch, right?
Yeah, there's a Rolex.
Yeah, fancy watch. Yeah. At that, it is worth noting that you obviously are on the campaign trail a lot. Donald Trump is going to be in North Carolina this week outlining his economic policy. We expect now that Kamala Harris will also be in North Carolina on Friday to outline hers. This is after we heard her float the idea of no taxes on tips, which Donald Trump had floated. J.D. Vance is talking about an expanded child tax credit, something that Democrats like Harris have long been in favor of. So when we get these economic policies fully outlined, are we going to come to find that there's actually not that much difference between them?
I mean, I think that's the most interesting thing about this election cycle so far. There's been so many areas where it actually seems like Democrats and Republicans agree. You know, even just looking at the last year, Democrats in the House and Senate decided to take up an immigration bill, right? And obviously it didn't go through, but just the fact that these issues are things that everyone is talking about and everyone cares about shows a lot more agreement than disagreement among the two parties.
Yeah, absolutely. Stephanie Lai, thank you so much, as always, covering politics for us here at Bloomberg. We appreciate it. And as Stephanie brings up that border agreement that obviously did not make it through Congress, Donald Trump also pointed out on the call last night that she seems to be trying to be Trump when it comes to stricter border measures. At least that was his suggestion. She, too, has started singing a different tune than she was when she ran for president the first time around in 2019.
We talked a little bit yesterday about some of the overlap on other issues. Expanded child tax credit promoted by J.D. Vance. No taxes on tips promoted by Kamala Harris. Maybe things get a little mushy on some of these issues. Then there's the matter, of course, of geopolitics, knowing that we could have a significant number of protesters and even uncommitted delegates at the Chicago convention next week. Kailey, we're still waiting to find out what Iran will do to retaliate against Israel.
And this is actually something that came up on this X space between Donald Trump and Elon Musk last night. Here's what the former president had to say on this matter.
They're all waiting for an attack from Iran. Iran would not be attacking, believe me. You know, when I was there, and I say it with respect, because I think we would have been good with Iran. I don't want to do anything bad to Iran, but they knew not to mess around.
So for more on what's happening in the Middle East, and I guess what would have happened if there were a different president in the office or not, Michael Allen is with us now. He is former special assistant to the president during the Bush administration, now managing director and partner at Beacon Global Strategies. Mike, always good to see you here in studio on Bloomberg TV and radio. Appreciate you joining us. So Donald Trump has said this about a number of hot geopolitical conflicts in the world, that Russia never would have gone into Ukraine, that what's happening in the Middle East October 7th wouldn't have happened. Obviously, they both happened now. I don't know if you really believe that to be true. But his suggestion that Iran wouldn't be going after Israel, considering the contentious nature of Israel's role in the Middle East that has been there pretty much perpetually.
Right.
Is this being intellectually honest?
It's hard to just throw out a counterfactual and make an assertion. There's no way to test it, of course. I think what he's trying to do is premise everything on what most people agree was a bad call from President Biden, and that was the way that he got out of Afghanistan. And the narrative starts there, which is that because of the way you did it, you were weak and perceived as weak, and therefore everybody moved against you. I think that's a fair criticism that people can make, but I mean, can we discern either way? These counterfactuals, it's too hard to do, but it's politics. We're in a presidential election year, and I understand people are going to make those arguments.
It's been almost 2 weeks. Tomorrow is 2 weeks since the killing of the political leader of Hamas in Tehran. What is Iran waiting for, or is this part of the retaliation, as has been suggested, the wait?
Yeah, I've seen a little bit about that. Maybe they're trying to do psychological mind games on the Israelis, but I don't really think so. I think it's one, like we've talked about, they need to land a punch this time. So they need to figure out the combination of cruise missiles and or ballistic missiles and drones, some of which need to get through. But the hard part, the other thing they need to balance is that they don't want to be extraordinarily successful, and they don't want to kill too many civilians, because then that might risk a total war with the Israelis. And I don't think the Iranians really want to get into a complete and total war. They benefit by having their proxies operate, and that leads to the sort of the second thing that they're weighing, which is Hezbollah is going to take some shots, but are they going to go at them in a total war type fashion, or is it going to be just enough to make them look credible, to make them look strong, but not provoke a multi-week contest with the stronger Israelis?
Well, surely they're also weighing the fact that currently another proxy, Hamas, and Israel and other mediators are at least talking again when it comes to a ceasefire. I believe Hamas still hasn't firmly committed to joining those talks that have been suggested for Thursday. How did the ceasefire negotiations factor into this calculation? Can both of these things happen? Iran retaliates and a proxy finds some kind of deal with Israel?
I think you're onto something. I didn't think it made sense to put all these things and try and cram them together. I understand the Biden administration is trying to do all that they can to get a ceasefire, but more importantly, to get these hostages home, especially since at least 5 of them are Americans. But I didn't think it just sort of suited what was on the international agenda for the week, which is Hezbollah is trying to take a shot at Israel, Iran, the so-called head of the octopus, and I didn't think that Hamas was going to just step up and say, hey, you know what, it's time for us to make this deal now. I think it would look weak if Sinwar were to make it now, because it would have made them seem afraid of what the Israelis were about to do. So I know how badly everybody wants it, but it didn't seem like the week to advance the ball on it.
Yeah. Well, in the meantime, the Pentagon's busy sending a guided missile submarine to the theater, the USS Georgia, 150 Tomahawks on board. The USS Abraham Lincoln aircraft carrier strike group is speeding its way there now. There's a question about whether this is deterrence or whether we're girding for something more substantive than what we saw in April.
So I totally agree it's deterrence, but there's another factor, and that is, what is the status of the Iranian nuclear program? I don't put this at a high probability, but a couple of things have happened lately, and that one, the U.S. intelligence community has backed away from its pronouncement that Iran is no longer working on the weaponization of a nuclear weapon. By that, they mean putting the fissile material together and putting it on a ballistic missile or something. So that's significant. People have noticed that. And at the same time, the Iranians are thinking to themselves, if we go into a total war situation, what's to stop the Israelis and maybe the United States? I wouldn't put it over 50%, but you've got to think about it. What if the United States says, you know what, I didn't really want Iran to go nuclear on my watch anyway, says President Biden, so maybe we'll go for it now. Don't think that's it, but you have to consider it when you think about how much progress Iran has made on fissile material and now perhaps have restarted the weaponization part of a bomb.
Well, you allude to this idea that Biden may be going for things he once was not. Can we also call that true now in the conflict in Ukraine, considering the U.S. policy for a very long time in this war was not to support offensive action against Russia? And now Ukraine has seized 1,000 kilometers of territory in the Kursk region in Russia, and you're seeing 100,000 more Russians flee there. What is your read on what's happening there? Is this something that the U.S. is really behind?
I think that the U.S. probably wasn't consulted because they didn't want to know what the answer would be. I think the Ukrainians kept it a big secret. It sounded like many of the top figures in Ukraine didn't even know what they were doing, even those that were in the officer corps that got moved into the line of fire. I do, however, believe that this is great that the Biden administration is apparently not fighting it. I think that they are
allowing it to happen.
Allowing it to happen, not hectoring the Ukrainians about what they're up to. Because to me, and we'll have to see how it works out, it's an ingenious move. It's put Putin on the defensive. It's caused, apparently, we're starting to see news reports that the Russians are moving troops out of the south of Ukraine to reinforce where the Ukrainians are running and making incursions into Kursk. So that's good news. I'm not ready to declare this a victory or that the course of the war has changed, but I'm really glad to see that the Ukrainians are mixing it up.
Well, you're seeing tens of thousands of Russians, also civilians, be evacuated from that area. Could we be talking days from now about something awful that Vladimir Putin is going to do to the troops in that region? He's clearing out civilians to do something.
I think it's very, very possible. You almost can't put anything past what Putin might be up to. I think he is absolutely trying his best to think of something new to penalize the Ukrainians with, and they better look out. Something's coming at them, but I think they're largely fearless. I think they're glad that they're on the offensive for once, that their military has come up with something ingenious and new so that they're not always sitting in a trench having positional warfare with the Russian troops coming across.
It's good to have you back with us, Michael. Thank you. Michael
Thanks
Allen with insights from Beacon Global Strategies, his perch now, former special assistant to the president in the Bush administration. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz in Washington, where we have a lot more to cover. We start today with geopolitics. We turn back to the campaign trail ahead with our signature panel. Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino are on board. Tim Walz making his big solo debut on the campaign trail today. We'll have a lot more next. This is Bloomberg TV and Radio.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio, where, of course, we bring you all of the political coverage you need to know, and we do it as a team. And Tim Walz and Kamala Harris are a pretty new team. Now,
Yes,
we
they
just
are.
learned officially that they have become a team on the Democratic ticket as of last week. And to this point, we've seen them on the campaign trail together. That changes today, though, for Tim Walz, who will be making his first solo campaign stop in Los Angeles. And of all things, Joe, this is happening with a union. He is speaking at the biennial convention of the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees. And of course, we know that the selection of Walz was welcomed by many unions, considering he is seen to be a very pro-labor governor, especially.
Yeah, unions snapped to attention as soon as Kamala Harris got to the top of the ticket, and they loved the idea. I think we can argue had quite a bit to do with the selection of Tim Walz over Josh Shapiro, remembering the concern over school vouchers and so forth for the governor of Pennsylvania. So, yeah, this is Ask Me, and he's going to be going to a fundraiser afterward in Newport Beach, California, which is where we start with our signature panel. Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino are with us, Bloomberg Politics contributors. Rick, of course, partner at Stone Court Capital, and Jeanne, political science professor at Iona University. It's great to see you both. Welcome aboard here. Jeanne, the battle for organized labor is pronounced, and I wonder how well Tim Walz has to perform on his first outing, his first solo outing on the campaign trail, or if that vote is already built in for this campaign.
No, he has to perform well. He also has the advantage of being a former union member himself, famously as a teacher. He also has a really strong union record as governor in Minnesota. When the Democrats took over the state legislature, he signed into law legislation that protected some of the most vulnerable workers there. So these would be like nursing home workers and others. They also get to earn paid sick leave, which is not something that is common across the country. And there will be a time in the future where they will get family and medical leave. So he's got a really solid record himself. And what he needs to do today, obviously, is he needs to get them riled up to support Kamala Harris by talking about what the Biden-Harris administration has done for workers and what she wants to do next when she is elected, hopefully from their perspective, president.
Well, as we consider the appeal to labor and unions, of course, we've seen a lot of this on the Republican side, too, as J.D. Vance especially has talked about the working man. Donald Trump, we know himself, has courted unions, too, maybe more so members than actual union leadership. But on the subject of unions, it is worth pointing out the United Auto Workers Union filed an unfair labor practice charge against former President Trump and Elon Musk after their X Spaces last night, Rick, accusing them of illegally intimidating workers after Trump was talking about how employers could fire workers for going on strike with Elon Musk. How does this play with the unions, the kind of conversation we saw between these two yesterday evening?
Yeah, I think it's mutually exclusive. I mean, the Musk interview was just a rally around the MAGA world. Musk is well known for his anti-union views. Didn't take a interview with Donald Trump to know that. And of course, Donald Trump never saw a union and he didn't want to break, even though he has some decent relationships with a few notable union executives. The bottom line is, the table is set on that as far as who's best for the unions. And this clash, I think, is just sort of electioneering, another way to sort of show the difference. But I think the mistake Democrats tend to make is that they they basically try to lump every working class individual in the United States as a union worker. And sure, you can love unions as they do, but it leaves out the vast majority of working people in America if that's all you talk about. And so great that, the vice presidential nominee Walz is doing this in California. And, these are obviously unions that he worked with directly, as governor. But like, if they don't expand that class and that conversation to non-union working class voters, then they're not talking to the right people, especially in the Sun Belt.
I want to just listen to what Donald Trump and Elon Musk were saying in that moment where he talked about this idea, and we'll continue our conversation. This is from the X Spaces convo between Elon Musk, who you will hear, as well as Donald Trump.
I think it would be great to just have a government efficiency commission that takes a look at these things and just ensures that the taxpayer money, the taxpayers' hard-earned money, is spent in a good way. And I'd be happy to help out on such a commission.
I'd love it
if it were formed.
Well, you're the greatest cutter.
Okay, so Elon Musk pitching himself for a possible role somehow there, it sounded like in a potential Trump administration, a 2.0. But Donald Trump went on after "you're the greatest cutter." He said, "I won't mention the name of the company, but they go on strike. And you say, that's okay, you're all gone. You're all gone. So every one of you is gone. You want to quit? They go on strike, and he gets rid of them." Jeanne, we keep talking about the fact that UAW rank and file have been voting for Trump over the Democrats in the last two elections, depending on which state you're looking at. How could that be the case with a conversation like this?
Yeah, I mean, I think when people start to focus on these kinds of statements, and that's what the Democrats are trying to do, is to say, great, you have two, million billionaires talking to each other, and this is where they come down, fire workers. That's what Democrats are going to be saying. Another thing they're going to be saying is look at what Project 2025 says about firing civil servants, the very union that Tim Walz is going to be talking to, placing them, potentially replacing them with political appointees, maybe banning public employee unions altogether, which is in keeping with some kind of commission, I guess, that Elon Musk wants to join, but not just for public employee unions, I guess, but for unions, particularly in the automobile sector. This is a disaster for Republicans if this is the message. Donald Trump was much better off when he was appealing to white blue-collar workers, both union and, to Rick's point, non-union. Talking about firing people, and particularly billionaires firing people, is not a message you want to send out right now. And I think this works to the Democrats' advantage.
I want to go back to this whole notion that it kind of felt like Elon Musk was asking Donald Trump for a job last night, Rick. I'm not sure if that was kind of the point of this whole exercise for Elon, but I wonder what the point of the exercise really was for the Trump campaign. Was this just about getting attention, or was this about trying to reset the messaging? And if so, considering he didn't even really seem to be able to recall the name of the vice presidential nominee on the Democratic ticket, Tim Walz specifically, was this a success for Donald Trump last night?
Yeah, anything that's not been an abject failure would be considered a success for Donald Trump in this last month. Most of his outings have been an epic failure. Here he could sit at his desk, he could read notes, he could be organized around some of the themes. His campaign has been begging him to please return to some level of normalcy with his talking points. There is an argument for, what he did for, in his administration economically. And of course, that's the appeal. What the platform at X gives him is a whole lot more people than the sort of quiet little crowd that has been assembled around, his own social media outlet, Truth. I think last night was over 1 million people who tuned in. That is significantly more than he's ever going to get, on Truth Social. So that was a success, to be able to expand his group, find listeners who are interested in him. My guess is the people who made up that audience were the media and his own hardcore supporters. So reassuring them that he's on a track to win, reassuring them that he's got a plan, not going off the rails on a lot of conspiracy theories. And frankly, I think Musk kept him from doing that. He sort of kept it along a chatty way. So I'd have to say they're probably all thankful that it went as well as it did. But I don't think it moves the numbers at all. I think these are people who are already supporting Donald Trump. He's not communicating with swing voters on X.
Interesting response from the Harris campaign on this, referring to the fact that these two rich guys cannot actually serve a live stream in the year 2024. Jeanne, I don't know if Elon Musk actually wants a role in another Trump White House if Donald Trump wins this election. Does this have more to do with working with the government as the leader of SpaceX, dealing with regulations, maybe getting a foot in the door for EVs in a Trump administration?
Yeah, I think all of the above. I think he would also, as an aside, like to keep energizing the X platform. You know, advertisements are still way down. He has been able to play with some of the reporting on the election so far. I mean, Joe Biden announced he was leaving the race on X. So I think he would like to attract more people to X as well. But, you know, to the point about these two, you know, you're sitting there listening, and I did after the elevator music for 45 minutes. And when Donald Trump is talking about the biggest threat is not from global warming, and we don't really have to worry about that because we're going to have more oceanfront property. I mean, this is the kind of statement he's sending out to people. You've got to be an extremely wealthy person to be thinking that global warming is not a threat because we're going to have more oceanfront property. I mean, it was mind-numbing to listen to. It was not disciplined. And he was pretty much all over the map. So I don't think this was the win his team wanted. He needs to be disciplined on Kamala Harris and what she will do to the economy, immigration, and security. That did not happen. You know, to borrow a used phrase, it was a very weird conversation between these two for 2 hours.
All right, we'll leave it on that note. Jeanne, Sheehan, Zaino, and Rick Davis, Bloomberg Politics contributors, thank you both so much. As always, it was certainly a long conversation. I think we can call it that. And of course, the first portion of it, Joe, was really dominated by Trump's recounting of the assassination attempt in Pennsylvania last month, which he said in his RNC speech when he was accepting the nomination, he was only going to tell that story once. Yeah. But we heard it several times, it seemed, last night.
Said it wasn't very nice. And Elon Musk suggesting that he was inspired by what he saw that day.
Yeah, that's why he endorsed him, he
The
says.
statement from the Harris campaign that I referred to, Trump's entire campaign is in service of people like Elon Musk and himself, what they describe as self-obsessed rich guys who can't run a live stream in 2024.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
So much happening in the world of politics. This is Balance of Power live from Washington on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz in Washington. An important day, an important week when it comes to the economy. Kailey, PPI today. We're going to look ahead to CPI in a moment with breaking news now that has to do with the conversation we were having earlier this hour. The wait for a possible ceasefire deal in Israel or a possible retaliatory strike by Iran against Israel, both up in the air right now, Kailey, and news from Axios that the Secretary of State is changing his travel plans.
Yeah, of course, Axios had reported that Blinken was going to be heading to the Middle East this week as we await both news on Iran retaliation and also news on a ceasefire agreement. Now Axios is reporting that Blinken has postponed that trip, will not be traveling to the region tonight due to uncertainty around the situation. Axios here citing two sources. And it just speaks to the very uncertain nature of what's happening in the Middle East right now, which of course does factor into the markets. Amy was there talking about impact potentially on oil prices. And what we do know is that geopolitical conflict in the Middle East could actually have economic ramifications for that very reason if it did lead to the disruption of the way crude oil starts to move throughout the world.
Well, that's for sure. It's been pretty resilient so far, but of course, with so many questions about what would happen next, imagine if, in fact, Iran does land a punch, were the words that Michael Allen used, on Israel, we could be having a really different conversation.
Certainly. And it may lead to a different conversation than the one we're having now on the subject of inflation, ultimately. Of course, there is no predicting at this point that actually a war of that size and scale is going to erupt. Just that the risk is out there should Iran not calibrate this properly or Israel not calibrate its response accordingly. But the narrative right now is that inflation is on the way down, and that was borne out once again today in the PPI data we got, softer than expected. Yep. If you look at PPI ex food and energy month over month, flat. 0% is what we're talking about. And of course, this tees up the CPI report we're going to get tomorrow. So here to talk about all of this is Lara Rhame, who is with us now. She's chief U.S. economist over at FS Investments. Welcome to Balance of Power, Lara, here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Great to have you. We obviously have been seeing now what to me feels like we could maybe call a trend in softer than expected inflation data. I'm not sure the Fed is going to feel quite ready to call it that yet, unless you think differently, or do we have to wait until CPI tomorrow to say that for sure?
We do need to wait for CPI tomorrow simply because, the household is really the big engine, both driving the economy, and that's the biggest sector when we think of inflation and that sort of loop to wages and then again back to inflation. So when we look at the trend, it certainly has been really positive and moving in the right direction over the last 2 months. We saw after 4 really tough months where inflation spiked January to April, then 2 months where we really got a much more benign reading. And I think everyone's looking to tomorrow's data to reinforce that trend. And I think to open the door wide for the Fed rate cut that everyone's expecting on September 18th.
Well, how about reinforcing the idea that the Fed might have waited too long here, Lara? The Personal Consumption Expenditures Price Index, which we all obsess over, the PCE, said to be the Fed's preferred inflation measure. All the components from PPI that feed the PCE were tame. Should the Fed have cut in July when it had the chance?
I'm not terribly worried that the Fed is meaningfully behind the curve. The reality is that the economy remains healthy and on solid footing. My forecast is really for an incremental slowdown. The reality is the pace of growth has been so strong. One might argue it has been unsustainably strong. Moving from 2.5% growth to 2% is a slowdown. And I think markets were just really caught wrong-footed because expectations had been really, I would say, at volume 11, maximum optimism. So I think it's a mistake to read an incremental slowdown as weakness. And let me put it another way. If the Fed is behind the curve, they have room to cut rates more significantly. But I'm going to look beyond the ISM manufacturing data for that.
Well, just as we're having this conversation, Lara, Raphael Bostic of the Atlanta Fed is participating in a moderated Q&A. He says he's hopeful in the next several months of a normalized economy. He also says a rate cut is coming, but he wants to see a little more data. Obviously, we're going to get more of that data this week. And if a rate cut comes, the expectation is it won't be until September, when we're going to be just around the corner from a presidential election, Lara, which Joe and I spend the great chunk of our time, the biggest chunk of our time covering. And we're hearing more and more about the economic policies that each of these candidates, Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, may put forward. We'll hear even more from Harris later on this week. She's expected to outline it in North Carolina. But it does seem like we're getting similar things, be it related to the child tax credit or this notion of perhaps no taxes on tipped income. From your view as an economist, we've heard a lot about what that would do to the actual U.S. balance sheet, if you will, the kind of revenue lapse that may result from that. But what would that actually do to a labor market that is maybe just now starting to feel the effects of tighter policy? What would that do to wages and the way that things literally just work in the U.S. labor market?
I think that particular policy may be more popular because it's a way of helping that lower cohort of workers without putting the burden on the employer. Because, things like the minimum wage increases, I think, have been mixed in popularity because the employers feel that burden in a more pronounced way. And I think maybe underlying this, there is another issue, which is that we're starting to see delinquency rates from, creep up in credit card loans and auto loans. that is that sort of lower cohort of income that has obviously also felt inflation most acutely. So, it's a question of paying for these tax cuts. I think, unfortunately, that's what it always comes down to. And we'll see as these policies develop. Certainly, I think it's something that hopefully will be, I would expect to be popular across the board. And I think this is an area that we're watching closely because cracks are forming in the balance sheet of that cohort of employee.
Well, as we speak now, Lara, we still don't have plans from either campaign, detailed plans on how they would work to lower prices. Both are promising to do so. We just don't know how. In the case of Vice President Harris, we've been reporting that she's going to be fleshing out her whole economic plan in Raleigh on Friday. What does she need to say to be different than so-called Bidenomics? Is there such a thing as Kamalanomics?
So we're going to find that out together. But I think when it comes to the Fed and the way that they think about their policy changes, they really wait until actual policy has been enacted or announced. They're definitely not making policy changes based on campaign rhetoric. So I think it's something to keep in mind as we move into 2025, because on the one hand, you have, some policy proposals to lower costs and lower prices. And on the other hand, things like tariffs are inflationary. So we need to really, I think, keep in mind that different policy proposals impact both sides of the inflation equation. And when we look at, in particular, as the campaign rhetoric heats up, the Fed is really going to keep its eye on the ball of the data that's right in front of them and not think too far ahead about what inflation could do in coming quarters.
Well, yeah, we consistently hear the Fed is data dependent. It is not going to operate with political factors in mind, hence why we could see them cut in September, despite perhaps some Republicans suggesting that that would be perceived politically. We've also heard from both of these candidates about the independence of the Fed just within the last week. Donald Trump, at a news conference in Mar-a-Lago last Thursday, was talking about this notion that he actually thinks the president should have input into monetary policy. Kamala Harris begs to differ on that. We heard her say so this past weekend. When we actually think about that notion of Fed independence, though, what mechanisms are realistically in place to prevent that kind of political interference? Is this literally entirely up to the given Fed chair and whether or not he or she is willing to consider what the president wants in policy decisions?
I think we have now, 4.5, 5 decades of evidence that it really does work well when the Fed is truly independent. And let's face it, higher interest rates, rate hikes have never been popular with the sitting administration. We saw that under Clinton. We just didn't have, Twitter at that time, and we let sort of a more back channel pressure get applied by maybe the Treasury Secretary, Robert Rubin at the time, sort of, saying some rhetoric to that effect. But at the end of the day, it's never popular when rate hikes happen. And the reality is we do often need them as a policy response. The Fed needs to have that latitude. I think there is another layer to this as well, where we may see, and the reality is it would probably take Congress to make some of these changes to the Federal Reserve Act. But there is another layer to this, which is in emergency situations, the Fed has come through in very heavy-handed terms with some of their, financial market provisions and facilities. That may be an area where also politicians over time try to claw back some Fed independence. But I think that is very low on the list of priorities. And certainly, when we look at the way the Fed's handled policy over 5 decades, it's hard to point to independence as being a problem.
Lara, in our last moment here, I asked you about Kamala Harris's plan to lower prices, or I guess plan to be unveiled. So I should ask you about Donald Trump's. He says, drill, baby, drill. If you increase production enough to unlock lower oil and gas prices, that filters through the system and does the job. Is that a plan?
Clearly, oil and gas is going to be central to both parties' economic plans in terms of, keeping prices lower, and I think, keeping gasoline prices lower, because this is a huge psychological pain point for households. When gas prices get above 5%, $5 a gallon, households really find that psychologically challenging. However, that has not been a key source of inflation. And really, I think we see spikes in gas, but they come back down again. The U.S. energy industry today is much more mature, and I think much more rational about their ability and their productivity to create and supply gas. I don't think that necessarily more drilling is actually a magic bullet for other problems that may be more related to distribution, refinery, and other areas, which may, at the end of the day, impact inflation for households more specifically.
As we continue producing at record levels here in the U.S. Lara Rhame, thanks for joining a great conversation with the chief U.S. economist, managing director on the investment research team at FS Investment. Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.